Hello everybody, this is Zaxter99, and today I want to go ahead and talk about my childhood. Something in my childhood anyway. Obviously my drive home is only 20-25 minutes, but I think I can share with you guys, anybody that's interested, a little about my childhood as I remember it. Just a few random things about my childhood here. I remember I lived in Texas as a young kid, and I moved to Idaho, way up north in the Rocky Mountains. Huge change from the climate and culture of the panhandle of Texas. When I moved to Idaho, a very Rocky mountain state, and I had never seen mountains like there are here in Idaho as a kid. And I remember my dad and I driving up in the mountains here and seeing the mountains for the first time. Even at 8 years old, I was blown away. I was in complete awe of the kind of terrain and the Rocky Mountains that exist up here in the Northwest of the USA. And so I fell in love with Idaho immediately. Now, my whole outdoor, what might have been I might have turned into an outdoorsman, loved the outdoors, might have got into rock climbing or whitewater rafting or 100 other things. But instead, not long after we moved here, my grandparents, who still live down in Texas, bought me. This was back in a time when video games were really popular, and I would borrow money from my mom, or ask my money from mom, not borrow, but I asked my money from my mom after school and stuff like that, and I'd go and put quarters into the video games. It was when video games were cool, and going to the arcade and pumping those quarters into all those asteroid type games and Pac-Man and all the kung fu games and stuff like that back in the early 80s was popular. And so I don't know how many quarters I pumped into games like Asteroids and Centipede. And I remember I really liked Missile Command. And I would pump so much money into those damn machines. And a quarter back in the 1981, 1982, that was a lot more than a quarter is today. Probably about 3 times as much. A quarter back then was probably about somewhere between 50 and 75 cents today. And the graphics on those games weren't nothing like what everybody has today on home consoles. Free games on the PC that you can download free are way better than those old games, graphics-wise and everything. But my love for computers started not long after that, when my grandparents decided to buy me something besides the super popular Atari 2600. Which was nothing but game cartridges and games. Super popular console. My grandparents bought me the Atari 400 home computer. Now, I wanted a home computer. I thought that was really cool. My grandparents probably spent a fortune on this thing. And I think they were thinking, or probably went to a store or whatever, and a salesman had probably told them or whatever, this home system was better for kids because it didn't actually have the keyboard type buttons. It was all flat, and you kind of had to push harder on the buttons. It was all just a straight panel, so if I spilled something on it or whatever, it wouldn't be as likely to short it out inside or whatever. So my grandparents bought me this Atari 400, and I used it for quite a while, but one of my best friends and our school had the Commodore 64. So the Commodore 64 was by far the most popular home computer in the early 80s. I mean, it was the computer to have if you were going to have a home computer. So I really wanted that, and I believe what I did is I had the Atari 400 for just a few months or 6 months or something like that. And I ended up selling it for like $150 or something back then. Probably, I don't know how much less than my grandparents had paid for it. And I sold it, and my parents had to advertise it in the paper, because back then we didn't have Craigslist and all the different, things that are common today to sell your things. Everybody had to, if you wanted to sell something, you had to list it in the classifieds in the paper. And so we listed it, and it took a few days to sell. And I think it was like September or October or something like that, maybe August, when I sold it. And my parents weren't rich, so they couldn't just put up the money to, go buy me and pay the difference to give me a Commodore 64. So I had to wait until Christmas to get my Commodore 64, and so I gave up my home computer, because I wanted a Commodore 64. I waited at least 3 or 4 months and was sure that I would get a Commodore for Christmas, because my parents had said they'll put the money from they sold the Atari for and put it towards the cost of the Commodore, with my Christmas present. So I'll never forget Christmas morning. That morning, I have 2 younger sisters, and at the time I must have been 9 or 10, I guess, probably 10 years old. Yeah, that sounds about right, about 82. I was about 10 years old, and I walked out there Christmas morning after probably being awake and so excited half that night to get a Commodore computer, and walked out into our living room, and I didn't see a box with my Commodore on it laying out anywhere. And all I saw was like a radio and a little pile of stuff, and a radio and a ghetto blaster type thing, and some real small dolls for girls and Barbies and stuff. And the only thing, I had 2 younger sisters, the only thing that I could imagine that would have been for me was the ghetto blaster, Looked like about a $20 stereo or radio. Probably more expensive back then in 1980. But, it wasn't a real fancy one, wasn't a real big one, and it was kind of mixed in with some dolls and Barbies and stuff. But I assumed that was the only thing that possibly could have been for me. And so I was already absolutely heartbroken. My heart was being ripped out. I was so expecting to get that Commodore 64 for Christmas after waiting several months, after selling the computer I did have, and it wasn't out there. And I think it probably took everything that I had to keep from showing my disappointment. And I squatted there in front of the little radio, and my mom told me, "I don't think that's for you, Zach. I think that's your sister's." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And my mom said, "Maybe you should just look in your stocking." And I'm thinking, wow, what? So I start looking through my stocking, which we was already familiar with by the time I was 10. All that ever was stuff like chapstick and just stuff, my mom had put in the stocking. Nuts, walnuts, and, Reese's candy and Kisses, and, Hershey's Kisses and candy and junk, and little small toys and little small things like chapstick and, deodorant and crap like that. Nothing a kid's really going to be interested in. We can get candy anytime, So I'm sitting there looking through my stocking and picking through all the pieces. And I'm sure my mom and dad, they were sitting there on the couch watching me, probably about to bust a gut, laughing. But they held it together. And the whole time, my heart is just sinking. I'm thinking to myself, what the heck? My sister's got a pile of toys there. I sold my computer, and I don't have anything except a stocking full of candy. And my mom made some comment I'll never forget. My mom made some comment. She said, at a certain age, you got to kind of outgrow Christmas, and Santa Claus starts, making sure he gives, your younger sisters things. And I was thinking to myself, really? At this time, I kind of knew what was up with Santa Claus and all that. And I was thinking to myself, are we that broke that you guys can't even afford to get me something? Anything? Besides just the stocking stuff? That's what I was thinking. I didn't say anything. My heart was still breaking inside. And I think I was about ready to just put my stocking up and go back to bed, and just go back and crash to bed. And maybe I would have cried in my bed. I don't know. I don't know. I really don't remember that well. I remember being disappointed, but finally, though, as I'm kind of shuffling through, I pour out the rest of the stocking and everything like that, and I think I see a little folded up note or something that was in there, and it was a little note, and it said, maybe you should look behind the couch or something like that. And so our couch was kind of back against the wall, but I kind of noticed that the couch was, pulled out a few inches. Sure enough, right behind the couch there, packed snug between the couch and the wall, was my Commodore 64. And I cannot even tell you how dramatic that was for me as a 10-year-old kid. For my parents to tease me like that on Christmas and have me sitting there digging through candy and going through long moments of disappointment and heartbreak, probably 10-15 minutes, before actually seeing that I got what I wanted and what I'd been waiting for. Man, I'll never forget that moment. And I still remember my mom talking to my grandma, my parents, and, her family and stuff like that on the phone. And I remember her saying things like, she was surprised at how well I held my disappointment in, and how I acted like I was, like I didn't want to show my disappointment. I didn't get mad, I didn't cry, and my mom, I remember saying that I was such a good kid because, she could tell I was disappointed, but I didn't say anything or do anything, So, I'll never forget that, though. And, my parents weren't rich. So, if you know anything about those old computers, I remember that computer, we didn't have money for games. So, I didn't have any kind of games or anything like that with it. And games were, $40 a piece or whatever for that thing. But most of the games came on a floppy disk. And to play the games, you had to have a disk drive. And a disk drive was like twice as expensive as the Commodore. I think the Commodore was like $249 back in the 80s, which is a lot of money nowadays. Probably $700-800, the equivalency, I don't know. But I think it was like $249 for a Commodore back then. And the disk drive was like $300 or $350, I don't even remember. It was a lot more. And so obviously I didn't get the disk drive, I didn't get any games or anything like that. And they had a device where you could save, anything you typed in or anything like that. They had little cassette drives made for the Commodore, but those were like $40 or $50. And I didn't get one of those on Christmas either. So the only way I could play a game was, I think another present they gave me was like a book. Like a book made by Compute Magazine, and it had like 15 games that you could type in. And this is all like basic or machine language, code. And you had to type this stuff in letter for letter, line for line, hundreds and hundreds of lines of code printed in a book. And if you made one little typo, you wouldn't know until you tried to run the program at the end. And the thing would, your Commodore would freeze up on you half the time when you did it. And if it froze up on you, the only way to get it back to going is to turn it off and on. And if you didn't have anything to save your work on before you turned it off and on, you lost everything. So you would have to go back in and retype hours and hours worth of code in for a lot of these little games. Just simple little games where you're like an X, moving around with a joystick from circles or periods on the screen. you know, just simple little games were just tons and tons of code. And so I would sit there and I would type these games in, and you know, I got to where I was pretty good at typing stuff in and checking my work line for line, so that at least I would get to play a game for a couple of hours that I typed in before I finally had to turn the computer off or whatever, and I would lose all my work. And if I wanted to play that same game again, I would have to type in those hours worth of code again. So some of these longer games that were, you know, just tons of, you know, I remember just some of these games were like 40 hours worth of typing, and I got to where I could type pretty fast. But I would avoid those really, really long games. I just typed in the simpler games until my birthday, which was like 3 months later. And then I finally got, for my birthday, I got one of those $50 cassette drives. And you would buy those blank cassette tapes, and you could record your data, everything you have, on a cassette. The problem with the cassette thing was it was so slow. You know, I mean, we're talking kilobytes worth of information here. You know, would take 10 minutes to load. And half the time the cassette wouldn't read right. You'd have to go back, and you'd also have to rewind the cassette to where, you know, you'd have to have the cassette rewound or fast forward to about the right point, and then search on the cassette for the name of the program. And if you typed anything wrong with the name of the program or didn't remember it or whatever, it wouldn't find it. And it would just sit there searching through the tape, you know, for... It was just really, really slow and clumsy. And it took me... I had that cassette drive with that Commodore from like 1982, in Christmas 1982, I believe until 1985 or 1986, about 3 or 4 years before my parents actually had the money to get me that disk drive that I needed. And I owned that Commodore from 1982, Christmas of 1982, until I was out of high school in probably 1992, 1993. I had it over 10 years. So, I mean, no computer nowadays can last and be something that would be the #1 home computer for 10 years. So in that regard, the Commodore 64 held its own better than any computer ever has since then. Amazing machine. I really love that Commodore 64. I can't tell you how many programs I typed in out of the different magazines, compute magazines. I started learning a little bit of basic code. But the problem when I was that age is I would start, you know, I'd kind of learn basic and I'd have an idea for a game, and I would just get a little bit into it and then I'd give up, you know, as a kid. So I never really made anything of significance myself, but man, did I type in a lot of different programs from that Compute Gazette magazine. And a lot of those simple little games I really, really liked. And that computer was amazing. I bet you I spent many hundreds, probably thousands of hours on that computer as a kid. So that is my story about part of my childhood, a big part of who I was. You know, kind of what probably turned me into the kind of geeky guy that I am today was that whole computer era that started in the 80s, video games and the home computer deal and the Commodore 64. I mean, computing and stuff like that back in the 80s was not cool like it is now. I mean, nowadays, if you play games or you play World of Warcraft or whatever, you know, you can be pretty cool and do that. But back in the 80s, when the Commodore 64 was popular, I mean, if you played the Commodore 64 as much as I did, you were a freaking nerd. You know what I mean? You know, you were pretty geeky to you know, go home every day and type in programs and, you know, play simple little games like I did. But that's part of who I am. I'm sharing that with you guys as my drive home number 9. Be sure you comment. Be sure you rate this video. Let me know what you guys think. That is part of who I was and how I got to be who I am today. Probably has to do with a lot of things. I mean, why I do customer service, why I'm computer proficient, why I repair and build computers nowadays. I mean, a lot of it started way back when I was, you know, just a young kid with the popularity of video games and the Commodore 64 back in the 80s. So let me know what you guys think. Be sure you rate this video. Be sure you comment down below. Be sure you subscribe so you get future videos. Thanks for watching. This has been Zaxter99. We'll talk to you in the next one. Take care, everybody.